The handcuffs were too tight. Evelyn Brooks, 71 years old, didn't say a word about that. She walked through the front steps of the Riverton courthouse with her wrists bound behind her back and her chin level, and the security officer beside her kept one hand on her elbow, like she might run. She wasn't going to run. She'd never run from anything in her life, and she wasn't starting now in front of a crowd of strangers holding phones up to film her. Somewhere above the building, two military helicopters cut across the gray morning sky, low and loud enough to rattle the windows. Nobody in the crowd looked up. They were all too busy watching an old woman get walked into court like a criminal. She wasn't one. But nobody here knew that yet. If this story moves you, stay with me until the end. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Evelyn's story has traveled. Now let's begin. The courthouse in Riverton, Ontario, sat at the edge of a neighborhood that used to be working class and was now in the process of becoming something else. Cranes had appeared 6 months ago. Hoardings went up around a stretch of older homes on the south side of Magnolia Street, and the hoardings had the logo of a company called Caldwell Group printed on them in dark green letters. Some of the houses came down quietly. Some didn't. Evelyn Brooks lived at 44 Magnolia Street. Her house had not come down. The courtroom on the second floor was already half full when they brought her in. She recognized a few faces. A woman from her old church choir, the man who ran the hardware store 2 blocks from her house, a young reporter she'd spoken to briefly outside the week before. The reporter had a notebook open on her knee and was writing before Evelyn even sat down. The charge, as read by the clerk in a voice that managed to sound both bored and damning, was benefit fraud. Specifically, that Evelyn Ann Brooks had, over a period of approximately 19 years, unlawfully claimed government housing assistance, child care subsidies, and supplemental income support by falsely representing herself as the legal guardian of 3 minor children, when in fact she had held no formal legal status over those children at any time. The amount in question was listed as $342,000. The courtroom was very quiet when the clerk finished reading. Judge Victor Hale looked down at Evelyn from the bench with the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome and was only here as a formality. He was 63, with white hair combed flat, and reading glasses he wore low on his nose so he could look over them at people. He looked over them at Evelyn now. Ms. Brooks. His voice had that particular quality, not loud but carrying, the kind of voice built for rooms where people were required to listen. You've been offered a plea arrangement. I'd encourage you to give it serious consideration. I've already given it serious consideration, Evelyn said. And I won't confess to something I didn't do. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something between amusement and pity. Hale's mouth tightened slightly. That's your right, but I'll tell you plainly, the evidence against you is substantial, and this court has very little patience for Your Honor. The defense attorney, a younger man named Rowan Delacroix, who Evelyn had only met twice and wasn't entirely sure believed her, stood up. My client has entered a not guilty plea. We'd like to proceed. Hale gave Delacroix the kind of look that suggested he'd be remembering the interruption. We'll proceed after a short recess. He stood. Everyone stood. He walked out, and Evelyn sat back down and looked at her hands in her lap. The handcuffs had been removed when they brought her inside, and there were faint marks on her wrists from where the metal had pressed. She rubbed one wrist with the thumb of her other hand and didn't look at anyone. Delacroix leaned close. Are you okay? I'm fine. Evelyn, I said I'm fine, Rowan. She said it gently. Tell me what happens next. What happened next, in the immediate sense, was that the prosecutor, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the kind of aggressively neat appearance that suggested he spent time on it, laid out his opening case with the methodical confidence of someone who had done this many times and expected no surprises. The government, Fitch explained to the jury, would show that Evelyn Brooks had spent nearly 2 decades collecting benefits intended for legal guardians of minor children, despite the fact that she had never gone through proper adoption or foster care channels, had never been formally assessed or approved as a caregiver, and had in fact actively concealed this irregularity from relevant authorities in order to continue receiving payments she was not entitled to. 3 boys, Fitch said, walking slowly along the jury box. 3 boys whom Ms. Brooks took in, yes, and we are not disputing that she cared for them. But caring for children and being their legal guardian are not the same thing. And the government does not pay benefits for sentiment. It pays them based on verified, documented legal status. Ms. Brooks had none. He paused. Let that land. $342,000, he said again, paid out over 19 years. Paid to a woman who, according to every record in the system, had no legal right to collect a single dollar of it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. She did not look away. What Fitch could not say, because it was not part of the case he was building, was how those boys had come to be with Evelyn in the first place. He did not mention the night in November, nearly 22 years ago, when a colleague at Riverton General had pulled her aside and told her quietly that there were 3 kids in the pediatric ward, brothers, ages 4, 6, and 9, whose mother had died 3 days earlier and whose father was currently in federal custody. He did not mention that Child Protective Services had been called twice, that both calls had resulted in a logged entry and no follow-up, and that on the 3rd night, the youngest one, the 4-year-old, had stopped eating. He did not mention that Evelyn had walked down to that ward on her break, sat beside the boy's bed, and stayed. He did not mention any of that because none of it helped his case. The boys' names were Marcus, Daniel, and Tommy Osi. Their mother, Adaeze, had been a lab technician at Riverton General, which was how Evelyn had known her. Not well. Not as a close friend, but well enough to recognize her in the hallway and ask after her boys by name. Adaeze had talked about her sons the way some people talked about weather, constantly, naturally, as though it required no particular effort because they were simply the atmosphere she lived in. When Adaeze died, a pulmonary embolism, sudden and without warning, the boys had no one. The father, Kofi, was serving 18 months for a nonviolent financial offense and was not eligible for emergency custody. There was no extended family in the country. There were no neighbors who had stepped forward. There was a system, and the system had received 2 calls and produced 2 logged entries. Evelyn went to see the social services supervisor at the hospital. She explained the situation. The supervisor, a man named Brandt, had told her that a placement would be found for the boys within the week. That had been a Wednesday. By the following Tuesday, the youngest boy had been moved to a shared room, the middle boy had not spoken in 4 days, and the oldest had been brought down to the ER after hitting his head on the window frame of his room hard enough to need 3 stitches. Evelyn went back to Brandt's office. Brandt was not there. She spoke to his assistant, who told her the placement was still being arranged. On Thursday, Evelyn took the boys home. She had a 2-bedroom house on Magnolia Street, a 12-year-old car, a nurse's salary, and no plan. She made a bed on the floor of her living room for the older 2 and put the youngest in her spare room. She called in a favor from a colleague to cover her Friday shifts. She cooked dinner and the boys ate it in silence, and she sat at the table with them and did not try to fill the silence. She went back to social services the next week. And the week after that, she filed the paperwork she was told to file. She attended the meetings she was told to attend. She waited for the formal approval she was told was coming. It never came. The approvals stalled. The paperwork circulated. The case was transferred between 3 different caseworkers over the course of 8 months. Each time it was transferred to someone who had not read the previous notes. And Evelyn would sit across a desk from someone new and explain everything from the beginning, and they would nod and tell her it was being handled, and nothing would happen. Meanwhile, the boys were in her house. They were eating her food and wearing clothes she bought at the secondhand shop on Laurier Avenue and doing their homework at her kitchen table. Tommy, the youngest, started calling her Mama Evie somewhere around the 3rd month. She didn't correct him. A social worker named Louise Petrie, the 4th caseworker assigned to the case, finally told Evelyn the truth. Not directly. She wouldn't put it directly. But she said something in a careful, roundabout way that made Evelyn understand. The case was not moving because moving it would require someone to explain why it had sat unresolved for 8 months. And explaining that would require naming the people who had failed to act, and naming those people was something nobody in the building wanted to do. "What does that mean for the boys?" Evelyn asked. Louise looked at her file folder. "It means the placement process continues." "Louise," Evelyn kept her voice level. "Those boys have been with me for 8 months. The youngest one just started school. The middle one is in a reading program. What does it actually mean?" Louise closed the file folder. She didn't answer. Evelyn drove home. She sat in her car in the driveway for a long time. Then she went inside and made dinner and helped Tommy with his spelling words, and didn't tell any of them what she'd learned. She kept applying for benefits through the channels that existed, the ones that asked about household size and dependent children, and didn't at that point require proof of formal legal status that she couldn't get because the formal process was stuck in a loop created by the people who were supposed to clear it. She didn't lie on any form. She answered the questions as they were asked, and the benefits came through, and she used them to buy groceries and cover school fees and keep the heat on. This went on for 19 years. Marcus, the oldest, was the first to leave. He graduated high school with a full scholarship to the Royal Military College of Canada. Daniel, the middle boy, followed 2 years later, not to the same program, but to a law degree at the University of Ottawa, and then to JAG, the Judge Advocate General branch of the Canadian Armed Forces. Tommy, the youngest, took the longest path. But by 30, he was a warrant officer and a certified digital forensics analyst attached to the Special Operations Command. Evelyn retired from Riverton General after 31 years. She kept her house on Magnolia Street and her small pension and her vegetable garden in the backyard, and she was fine. She was genuinely fine. She visited the boys, men now, when she could, and they visited her, and she attended Marcus's promotion ceremony, and Daniel's call to the bar, and Tommy's graduation from the forensics program, and each time she sat in those audiences, something in her chest did a thing she couldn't quite name. She was fine. And then the Caldwell group arrived in the neighborhood with their cranes and their hoardings, and 6 months later she was sitting in a Riverton courtroom with marks on her wrists from handcuffs, listening to a prosecutor tell a jury she was a thief. The morning recess lasted 20 minutes. When Hale returned to the bench, there was a brief procedural exchange between Fitch and Delacroix regarding the order of evidence submission. Evelyn watched it without following most of it. She was watching Hale, actually, the way he sat, the slight lean to the left, the way he glanced at the clock on the wall with a regularity that suggested boredom rather than patience. He had already decided. She could see that. Delacroix had warned her. Hale has ruled against defendants in 3 of the last 4 benefit fraud cases, he'd told her in their second meeting. And 2 of those defendants had stronger procedural arguments than you do. Then why are we here? She'd asked. He'd looked at her. Because you said you won't plead guilty. I won't. Okay. He'd nodded, not like he was agreeing, but like he was accepting a fixed condition. Then we fight it. She hadn't told him about the calls she'd made to Marcus. She hadn't told him that 3 days before the arraignment, she'd sat at her kitchen table and dialed his number. And when he picked up, she'd said, "Something is happening, and I need you to know about it, but I don't want you to do anything." There had been a pause on Marcus's end that she knew well. It was the pause he'd learned to use instead of reacting immediately. She'd noticed it first when he was about 13, and she'd taken it as a good sign, the pause. It meant he was thinking before he moved. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The Caldwell group, the city notices, the charges, the court date. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom, you should have called me the second those notices showed up. I didn't want to worry you. You're facing criminal charges. I'm aware of that. Mom, Marcus." She said his name the way she had said it when he was 9 and 12 and 15, firmly, but with something underneath it that was the opposite of harsh. "I'm telling you now. That's what matters." Another pause. Then, "Okay, I'm going to make some calls." "I said I don't want you to. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to make some calls and find out what we're actually dealing with. Okay?" She'd agreed to that. She hadn't asked what calls he meant. The first witness of the morning was a records officer from the Provincial Benefits Administration office, a woman named Sandra Foy, who spoke in the flat, careful language of someone trained to present documentation without interpretation. She confirmed the dates, the amounts, the categories of benefit claimed. She confirmed that the household registration forms filed by Evelyn Brooks over the years had listed 3 dependents. She confirmed that a review of formal guardianship records found no corresponding legal documentation. Fitch walked her through it efficiently. Delacroix cross-examined gently, getting Sandra to confirm that the forms in question had not specifically required proof of legal guardianship at the time they were filed, and that the requirements had changed in subsequent policy updates. "So the forms Ms. Brooks submitted," Delacroix said, were compliant with the requirements that existed at the time she submitted them? The forms themselves were compliant, Sandra said carefully. The underlying legal status is a separate question. But the forms didn't ask about underlying legal status. Not at the time, no. Thank you. It wasn't enough to sink the case. Evelyn could see that from the jury's faces, the slight nods during Fitch's examination, the politely uncertain expressions during Delacroix's. They were trying to follow the procedural argument, and it wasn't landing. The second witness was a city official named Desmond Ragg, Deputy Director of Child and Family Services, who testified that Evelyn Brooks had never been approved as a foster care or formal guardian, and that the department had no record of any placement order covering the 3 boys. They had records of contact with me, Evelyn said quietly to Delacroix. I know, he said, equally quiet. I'll get to it. He did get to it. In cross-examination, he pulled up 4 documented contacts between Evelyn and the Social Services Office, including 2 in-person meetings. Ragg acknowledged the contacts. Delacroix asked whether those contacts had resulted in any action from the department. Ragg said the records indicated the case was under ongoing assessment. For how long? Delacroix asked. Ragg looked at the documents. There appears to have been a gap in active case management. How large a gap? A pause. The active file was closed in, Mr. Ragg, how large a gap? Approximately 3 years. A few people in the gallery shifted. Evelyn kept her eyes on the front of the room. So my client contacted your department repeatedly, trying to formalize her situation, Delacroix said, and your department failed to process her case for 3 years. The case was, yes or no, Mr. Ragg? The case experienced processing delays, yes. 3 years of processing delays, yes. During which time my client continued to care for 3 children who had nowhere else to go. Fitch objected. Sustained. Delacroix moved on. It was better, but still not enough. They broke for lunch at 12:30. Evelyn ate a sandwich in the small waiting room off the main corridor. Delacroix had suggested they not go out, which she understood. Outside the building, 2 of the people from the morning gallery were standing on the steps talking to the young reporter, whose name she'd learned was Priya Anand, writing for the Riverton Tribune. Evelyn watched them through the window. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. How is it going? She typed back. It's going. Then added, Delacroix is good. 3 dots appeared. Then, I know. We talked. She hadn't known they'd spoken. She sat with that for a moment. When are you home next? She typed. Soon, he sent back. Then, don't plead anything. Not yet. She put the phone away and finished her sandwich. The afternoon session brought 2 more witnesses, a financial investigator who had reviewed Evelyn's benefit history and an auditor from the city who'd been brought in by the prosecution to contextualize the amounts claimed over the years. Both were thorough, and both presented their information in the language of clear wrongdoing. Hale had been present for all of it, but his attention sharpened now, watching Fitch work. There was something in that sharpness, something that wasn't judicial interest exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of investment. At 3:45, Delacroix requested a brief continuance to retrieve a document he'd been waiting for from a records request. Hale looked at him over the glasses. How long? Until tomorrow morning. Hale's jaw tightened. This court will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow. If your documents aren't here, we proceed without them. Understood, Your Honor. Evelyn was gathering her coat when she heard it. Not felt it first. Heard it. A sound from outside the building, far off but growing, the rhythmic mechanical thud of rotor blades. Heavy aircraft. More than one. She glanced at the window. The sky above the courthouse was visible from one corner, and she could see the shape of 2 military helicopters banking toward the center of town, moving low and fast, not the way medical aircraft moved. Military. Not transport. Something else. She watched them until they moved out of frame. Then she put on her coat and went to find the car that was taking her home. She did not sleep much that night. Not from fear. She was past fear, had been for several weeks, had moved through it and come out on the other side into something calmer and harder. She sat up until almost midnight doing the crossword from that morning's paper, a habit she'd had for 30 years. And she thought about the look on Hale's face during the afternoon session, and she thought about Marcus's text, and she thought about 2 military helicopters flying low over Riverton at close to 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Don't plead anything. Not yet. She filled in 23 across, persevere, and then she folded the paper and turned off the light. At 8:59 the next morning, Evelyn Brooks walked back into the courtroom. She was early, which was her habit. The gallery was filling. Delacroix was at the defense table with his laptop open and a look on his face that she hadn't seen before, concentrated in a different way than yesterday. Not anxious. Alert. "Did you get the document?" she asked. "Better," he said, and didn't elaborate. Fitch arrived, then the clerk, then Hale, who took his position with the same flat authority as the day before. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Fitch said yes. Delacroix said yes. The rear doors opened. 3 men walked in. Not fast, not dramatic, they walked with the kind of measured pace that came from training. The eldest wore the rank of lieutenant colonel on his dress uniform. The middle one wore a JAG insignia. The youngest carried a hard-shell case and wore the rank of warrant officer. They were tall, all 3 of them. They looked alike in the way that people who grew up in the same house look alike. Not in features exactly, but in posture, in the angle of the head, in the quality of stillness they carried. Marcus, Daniel, Tommy. They walked to the front of the courtroom and stopped. Marcus looked at the judge. He looked at the prosecutor, and then he looked at Evelyn, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to conceal, and she felt her throat go tight in a way she hadn't expected. He turned back to the bench. "Your Honor," Daniel said, stepping forward with a leather folder already open. "We're here to file an emergency intervention on behalf of Evelyn Brooks. I'm Major Daniel Osei, Judge Advocate General Branch. This is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Osei and Warrant Officer Thomas Osei." He paused. "We're here for our mother." The room went completely still. Hale stared at them. Fitch stared at them. Every person in the gallery stared at them. Someone in the back row whispered something and was immediately hushed. Evelyn pressed her lips together and looked down at the table and said nothing. Her hands were folded in front of her. She did not move. Hale recovered first. "This court does not recognize military intervention in civilian proceedings, Major." "I understand, Your Honor." Daniel's voice was completely even. "We're not intervening as a military action. I'm filing as a licensed civilian attorney with standing as a direct interested party. My brothers are here as witnesses to evidence we've formally obtained and are prepared to present. The prosecution has not been notified of any. The evidence was obtained via formal records request and military declassification protocol," Daniel said. "All relevant parties received notification this morning at 7 a.m., including this court's administrative office." Hale looked at the clerk. The clerk checked something on the desk and gave a small nod. Hale looked back at the 3 men in front of him. The helicopters. The flight path over the courthouse. The timing of it all. Don't plead anything. Not yet. Evelyn looked up. Across the room, Marcus was looking at her, and his expression said the thing that he'd never been good at saying out loud. Not since he was 9 years old and she'd found him sleeping on the floor next to his brothers because he'd given them both his blankets, and he would not admit to being cold. She looked at him. She didn't try to keep her face neutral. Whatever happened next, they were here. All 3 of them, in this room, in uniform, in front of every person who had watched her get walked in the day before with her wrists in cuffs. Hale picked up his gavel. The sound of it was sharp in the too quiet room. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," he said. His voice had changed. Not much, but Evelyn caught it. A texture it hadn't had before. Not boredom, not authority. Something closer to concern. She looked at him, eyes closed, breathing steady, expression of a man who had decided to rest for the first time in a while. And the question stayed open, unanswered, pressing against the underside of everything else. Grant Mercer opened his eyes. Not slowly, the way people do when they've actually been drifting. He opened them like a switch thrown, immediate and clear, and looked directly at her, which confirmed what she'd already suspected. He hadn't been resting. He'd been thinking. "You're wondering if I set this up," he said. The thought crossed my mind. It was already in motion before tonight. He shifted against the motorcycle, testing his shoulder with a careful roll. "I just needed to be somewhere visible. You used yourself as bait. I used myself as a trigger." The distinction seemed important to him. "There's a difference." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then looked away. She wasn't sure the difference was as clean as he was presenting it, but she let it go. There were other things that needed her attention right now. The colonel, his nameplate read Varden, and she recognized the name from a dispatch chain she'd been part of in her second deployment, which meant he was not someone who showed up to minor incidents, had finished his call and was walking toward her with the measured pace of someone who had already decided what the next hour was going to look like. "Walk with me," he said. Not a question. They moved to the edge of the lot, away from the agents and the men on the ground and the idling motorcycles. The nearest camera was 40 feet away and pointing the wrong direction, which Evelyn had already calculated and suspected Varden had too. "How long have you been at Pinecrest?" he asked. 3 years in October. "Any contact with your unit since separation?" "No." "Anyone know your background here? Your supervisor? Anyone you work with?" "No." She paused. "The HR file has my discharge paperwork. General discharge, medical. That's all they asked about and all I told them." Varden nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. "Your records were flagged 8 months ago during the initial investigation into Boone's network. Your name came up in a database cross-reference. You're in the area, your prior service. You work nights at a facility that's been used twice as a secondary transfer point for stolen medical supplies moving through Boone's contacts." Evelyn went still. "I don't have anything to do with that." "I know. You were flagged as a potential witness, not a subject. But we needed to establish your position before we made contact." He glanced back at the lot. "Tonight accelerated that timeline somewhat, because I put 6 of his people on the ground." "Because you put 6 of his people on the ground in 41 seconds while a federal surveillance unit was running an active operation 3 blocks from this location and caught the whole thing on a long-range camera." He looked at her steadily. "You were never supposed to be in the middle of this." "I was walking to my car." "I know." "He had a pipe." "I know that too." Varden's expression didn't shift, but something in it acknowledged the absurdity of the position he was putting her in. "I'm not criticizing your decision. I'm explaining why the next 72 hours are going to be complicated for you." Behind them, a second federal vehicle had arrived. An Ashford PD supervisor's car had also pulled in, parking at an angle near the entrance, not blocking the federal vehicles, just present, watching. The supervisor stood beside his car and didn't come into the lot. The body language of someone who understood this was not his jurisdiction tonight. Evelyn turned back to Varden. "What do you need from me?" "A formal statement tonight, medical assessment of Mercer in writing since you've already treated him, and availability for the next 3 days for follow-up." He paused. "After that, we'll have a longer conversation about your role going forward." "My role?" "This investigation is bigger than Boone. He's a node, not the center. The network runs through 3 counties and has connections we haven't fully mapped." He stopped. "You have a skill set that's relevant." She looked at him. "I'm an ER nurse. You're a combat-trained medic with 11 years of civilian trauma experience, an ability to operate under extreme stress without losing clinical judgment, and you've now been directly threatened by people connected to this network." He said it without any particular emphasis, just laying it out. "You're also a witness. That means you're already in it whether you want to be or not." That landed. She let it. "I want to see my personnel file," she said. "Whatever you pulled." "That's reasonable." "And I want to know who Grant Mercer actually is, not the short version." Varden almost smiled. "Not quite. That's a longer conversation." "I have time." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been assessment or might have been something closer to respect, the kind that's functional rather than sentimental. Then he said, "Let's start with your statement," and turned back toward the vehicles. She followed him, and as she passed the spot where her lunch bag was still sitting against the Subaru's rear tire, she picked it up without stopping and dropped it in a trash can 10 feet further on. The sandwich was long past the point of being salvageable. The statement took 2 hours. They did it inside one of the federal SUVs. Not the most comfortable arrangement, but a private one, which was the point. A junior agent named Pollard, who looked approximately 26 and had the focused energy of someone running on their 3rd coffee of the evening, took the statement on a tablet and asked follow-up questions that were precise and largely good. Evelyn answered everything without elaboration and asked him to read each section back to her before she confirmed it. He seemed slightly surprised by that. She didn't explain it. She'd given statements before, in contexts where precision mattered in a life-or-death way, and the habit of checking the record was one she'd never seen a reason to drop. When they finished, she asked about Grant Mercer. "He's being assessed by our team medic," Pollard said. "He declined hospital transport." "He declined it, or someone talked him out of it?" Pollard hesitated just slightly. "He made the call himself. The shoulder reduction I did will hold for now, but he needs imaging. The laceration above his eye needs stitches, not steri strips. It's deep enough that it'll reopen. He's also moving his left leg with a slight compensation that suggests a previous knee injury that got aggravated tonight, and he's not going to volunteer that information." Pollard was typing. "I'll pass that along. Make sure someone actually does it, and doesn't just note it." He looked up at her. "I will." She got out of the SUV. The lot had changed in 2 hours. The motorcycles had organized themselves into rows near the far end, most riders off their bikes now, standing in small groups with coffee that someone had produced from somewhere. The 6 attackers were gone, transported, presumably, though she hadn't seen when. The Ashford PD supervisor's car was gone too. Boone was still there. He was sitting in the back of a different federal vehicle with the door open and one of the senior agents standing nearby. His body language had collapsed over the 2 hours. The broad-shouldered certainty she'd seen when he first walked into the lot was completely gone. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, staring at the asphalt in the specific way that people stare at things when they're running the same calculation over and over and getting the same answer they don't want. She didn't feel anything in particular looking at him. That was the honest answer. She'd expected to feel something. Anger, satisfaction, something. And there was nothing. Just the same flat clarity she'd had during the 41 seconds. He'd made a bad decision and was now in the process of living inside it. She walked toward the spot where Grant Mercer had last been and found him standing near the column's lead motorcycle, upright, his vest back on, talking with Colonel Varden. His shoulder was in a proper sling now, someone had found one, and the laceration had been butterfly taped, not sutured, which she noted with mild irritation. He saw her coming and stopped talking. "You need stitches," she said. "It's fine. It's fine right now. In about 4 hours, when the adrenaline finishes clearing your system, it's going to start bleeding again, and you're going to want to be somewhere with a needle and thread rather than wherever you're planning to be at midnight." He looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that had seen enough things that they'd stopped registering most inputs as remarkable. She'd met a few people with eyes like that, usually sergeants major. "There's a clinic 2 miles east," he said. "I'll go. Tonight. Tonight." A pause. "You're bossy for a civilian." "I was bossy in the Army too." She turns to Varden. "What happens to him now?" "Mr. Mercer is cooperating with the federal investigation. He's been cooperating for approximately 6 months. She looked at Grant. 6 months. "Give or take," he said. "And tonight was the 3rd time they've tried to move on me since I submitted my initial testimony." He said it the same way you'd say a thing about traffic or weather. "First 2 times I wasn't in a good position to respond. Tonight I was. You had 40 people on motorcycles nearby and federal surveillance running 3 blocks away, and you still almost got your head caved in." "Almost," he said, with an emphasis that was almost, not quite, a smile. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she wanted to ask him that she wasn't sure how to ask. She asked it anyway. "Why this parking lot?" He met her eyes. "It's covered by staff cameras that Pinecrest administration never bothered to fix. The gap I used is the same gap that was used 4 times to move stolen medical supplies through this facility." A pause. "I needed to be somewhere they'd feel comfortable moving on me, and I needed it documented." "You knew about the supply theft. That's part of what my testimony covers." She took that in. "You knew about it, and you know I work here." He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said, "Your name came up in the cross-reference. You were cleared immediately. Your schedule doesn't align with the transfer windows, and you have no contact with the relevant staff members. But yes, I knew you were here. And you didn't think to tell someone to warn me. Varden's team assessed that warning you would change your behavior in ways that might flag to Boone's network that the location was compromised." His voice was even. Not apologetic, but not dismissive either. "I didn't agree with that call." Varden, to his credit, didn't say anything. She stood with that for a moment, the cool weight of having been a piece someone else moved on a board she didn't know she was on. "All right," she said. Not because it was all right, because the next step mattered more than the argument. There's something else, Varden said. She waited. Boone knows you now. His network knows your face. What happened tonight is going to reach people above Boone's level before morning, and those people are going to want to know who you are. He paused. We can offer protection. I work tomorrow at 6. Evelyn, I work tomorrow at 6 and the day after that. I have patients. She looked at him. Offer me something practical. He studied her. A contact number for our field team. Check-ins twice daily until the network is contained. And a request, not an order, that you vary your routes and your schedule where you're able to. That I can do. He handed her a card. She looked at it. A phone number, a name she didn't recognize, and the letters DOJ in the corner, and put it in her scrub pocket next to the trauma shears. Grant Mercer was watching her. Go get stitches, she said to him. He almost smiled again. Yes, ma'am. She walked to her car. It was a 9-year-old Honda with one rear hubcap missing and a crack in the passenger side mirror that she'd been meaning to fix since February. She got in, closed the door, and sat in the dark for a moment with her hands in her lap. The parking lot lights were still buzzing. She could see in her rearview mirror the activity still going on at the far end. Agents, motorcycles, the federal vehicles, Boone's diminished silhouette. Her phone had 7 missed calls. 3 from a number she recognized as the Pinecrest nursing supervisor. 2 from a number she didn't recognize. And 2 from her downstairs neighbor Greta, who was in her 70s and who called Evelyn whenever she heard something unusual outside, which was endearing and sometimes inconvenient. She called the nursing supervisor first. Evelyn, there are police here asking about an incident in the parking lot. I know. I was involved. I'm fine. I'll come in early tomorrow and give a full account to administration. Are you? I'm fine, she said. Tell whoever's asking that the relevant parties are federal agents and they can direct questions to Colonel Varden. She spelled the name. I'll be in at 5:30. She hung up and sat for another moment. Then she started the car and pulled out of the lot and drove home through streets that were mostly empty at this hour. Radio off, window cracked 2 inches, thinking. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. She was up at 4:15, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the DOJ card face up in front of her, and her own thoughts for company. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had probably been nice in the 90s and was now functional and quiet and anonymous in the way she'd needed when she moved in. Her upstairs neighbor worked nights. The couple on her floor had a baby that sometimes cried at 3 a.m. but had been sleeping through lately. There was a grocery store 2 blocks east and a diner 1 block north that opened at 5 and whose owner knew her order. She'd built a life here that was specifically designed to fit around her without requiring too much of her. That had been intentional. That had been the plan. She looked at the DOJ card. Then she looked at her hands, resting flat on the table, and thought about what Grant Mercer had said. I knew your hands weren't trained in a hospital. She turned them over, turned them back. At 5, she put on her scrubs and drove in. The administration meeting happened at 5:45 in the office of Pinecrest's Director of Operations, a man named Delwith, who had the look of someone who had been getting alarming phone calls since midnight and had chosen to handle it by making the circles under his eyes larger and preparing a lot of questions. He had the hospital's legal representative on speakerphone and a printout of what appeared to be a police report summary that she noted didn't match the actual sequence of events in several important ways. The report indicates you initiated a physical altercation with 6 individuals in the parking lot, Delwith began. The report is incorrect. She put a copy of her formal federal statement on the desk. This is the statement I gave to the Department of Justice last night. It has been verified against security camera footage from the federal surveillance unit that was operating in the area. Delwith looked at it. The legal representative on the phone asked her to repeat the relevant section. She repeated it. A pause. You're saying there was an active federal operation? I'm saying that 6 men attacked an elderly man in the hospital's employee parking lot, and I intervened, after which the responding officer attempted to arrest me rather than the attackers, and federal agents who were present immediately took jurisdiction. She kept her voice flat and even, clinical. I've provided everything I can provide in writing. Any further questions can be directed to Colonel Varden. Delwith picked up the statement and read it with the focused expression of a man recalibrating quickly. You should have told us about your military background when you were hired, he said. not aggressively. More like he'd picked a thing to say and this was it. My military background wasn't relevant to the position I applied for. It's... He stopped, started again. People here might have... There's a context when you know someone's background. The position required nursing credentials and trauma experience. I had both. The other things in my record aren't relevant to my ability to do this job, and disclosing them wasn't required. She looked at him. I've done this job well for 3 years. I assume that's in the file somewhere. The legal representative on the phone spoke up. Ms. Carter's employment record is excellent. There's no basis for any disciplinary action given the information currently available. Delwith set down the statement. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, somewhere between unsettled and something that might have been, underneath everything, a grudging reassessment. You can go to your shift, he said. She picked up her copy of the statement and left. The ER that morning was the usual mixture. A pediatric asthma case that needed nebulizers and patience. An older man with chest tightening that turned out to be musculoskeletal rather than cardiac, but still needed to be ruled out carefully. 2 separate car accident victims from an overnight collision on the interstate who came in within 20 minutes of each other. A woman in her 30s who'd been waiting since 4 a.m. with a broken wrist from a fall and who was in quiet, stoic pain that Evelyn recognized and made sure didn't get deprioritized. She worked. Her hands did what they knew how to do. The shift moved the way shifts move when you're inside them. All texture, no arc. It was just after 11 when she came out of a supply room and nearly walked into a man who wasn't wearing scrubs. He was in his 40s, civilian clothes, the kind of jacket that's slightly too nice for an unannounced visit, and he had a way of standing in a hospital hallway that suggested he didn't feel any particular obligation to belong there. He looked at her, and there was something in the look that was specifically constructed, the kind of look that's designed to feel accidental. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you got a minute? I'm on shift." "It won't take long." He hadn't moved to block her. He was just there. "I understand things got complicated last night. There are people who'd like to make sure you're taken care of. Make sure this doesn't become a bigger issue for you than it needs to be." She looked at him, at the jacket, at his hands, which were empty and held loosely in that specific careful way. "Who do you represent?" she asked. "People who appreciate discretion." "In my experience, when people say they appreciate discretion, they mean they want someone else to be silent." He smiled. The smile was practiced and didn't reach his eyes. "That's a little cynical." "Put a name on the table or end the conversation," she said. "I have a patient in Bay 3 who's waiting." The smile held for a moment, then recalibrated into something else. Something that wanted to look like patience but had a different thing underneath. "The officer involved last night has a lot of friends," he said. "It would be a shame if a nurse with an otherwise clean record got drawn into something complicated. Federal investigations can be long. Careers can get affected." Evelyn looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pulled the DOJ card from her scrub pocket, held it up so he could see the number and the letters in the corner, and said, "I'm going to make a call after my shift. Do you want me to mention this conversation, or would you prefer I didn't?" The man's expression shifted in a way that was small but complete. "Have a good shift," he said, and walked back toward the elevator. She watched him go, noted the jacket, noted the slight deliberateness in the way he walked that people have when they're conscious of not appearing to hurry. She went back to Bay 3. But 3 hours later, when she came out of the ER at the end of her shift and walked toward the staff parking entrance, she stopped at the edge of the door and looked through the narrow window first. The man in the jacket was standing at the far end of the corridor near the hospital's east exit, talking on a phone. He hadn't left. She took out the DOJ card, and as her thumb hovered over the number, she heard footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful, and turned to find one of the ER residents, a third-year named Albright, walking fast with a face that had gone 2 shades wrong. "Carter, I need you back in Bay 2, right now." "My shift just ended." "I know." He was already turning. "It's Grant Mercer. He just came in by ambulance. Someone ran his motorcycle off the road." She was already moving before he finished the sentence, the DOJ card still in her hand, the man in the jacket forgotten for the moment. Though not for long, because this was no longer a coincidence, and she knew it, and the knowing of it settled into her chest like a stone dropping through cold water, all the way down. Something closer to concern. The 30 minutes Hale had called did not feel like a recess. It felt like a held breath. Evelyn stayed at the defense table while Delacroix moved quickly to the front of the room to speak with Daniel. She watched them. Daniel opening the leather folder, pointing to something, Delacroix reading it with the focused expression of a man recalibrating. Tommy had set the hard-shell case on the floor beside the gallery railing and was standing with his hands clasped behind him, scanning the room in the unhurried way of someone trained to notice exits and entry points as a matter of reflex. Marcus hadn't moved from where he'd stopped when they came in. He was watching the door through which Hale had disappeared. Evelyn knew that look. She'd seen it on him at 9 years old, standing in her kitchen the morning after she'd brought them home, watching the front door like he expected someone to come through it and take them away again. He'd had that look for months. It had taken a long time to stop. She didn't say anything to him yet. The room wasn't the right place. There were too many people watching, and she didn't want to perform whatever they had with each other for an audience. Fitch was at his table, speaking quietly but rapidly into his phone. His assistant, a young woman Evelyn had not learned the name of, was typing with both thumbs on a tablet. Fitch's composure was still technically intact, but there was a quality to his movements now that hadn't been there yesterday. A precision that looked like it required effort. Priya Anand, the reporter, was writing continuously. She hadn't stopped since the three men walked in. When Hale returned, he came back 3 minutes early and sat down without ceremony. He looked at Daniel. Major Osei, I've reviewed the notification submitted this morning. You're filing under civilian jurisdiction, is that correct? That's correct, Your Honor. My bar membership is Ontario. I'm filing as private counsel, with standing as an adult dependent of the accused. The prosecution's case is already underway. The intervention statute allows for emergency evidentiary submission at any point prior to closing arguments when newly obtained material evidence is introduced. The case law is cited in the filing. Daniel didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a man reading a bus schedule, factual, unhurried. Hale looked at Fitch. Mr. Fitch, have you reviewed the notification? I have, Your Honor, and the prosecution objects to... On what grounds? Fitch paused. That pause was something. We would need time to review the materials before they're admitted. How much time? At minimum, 2 days. Daniel spoke before Hale could respond. Your Honor, the materials include time-sensitive declassified records with a disclosure window. A 2-day delay risks. I'm not asking you, Major. Hale's voice had an edge now. Not anger exactly. Something tighter. I'm asking Mr. Fitch what grounds he's objecting on. Fitch straightened. Procedural fairness, Your Honor. The prosecution was not given adequate notice. You were notified at 7 this morning, Daniel said. The filing was submitted through the court's emergency intake system at 6:52. Major. Hale's tone landed like a closed door. Daniel stopped. Hale looked between them. Then he looked at Evelyn, and it was the first time since the trial began that his gaze had landed on her with any quality other than dismissal. She met it. She didn't look away, and after a moment he was the one who moved on. We'll recess until after lunch, he said. Mr. Fitch, you have until 1 p.m. to review the submitted materials and prepare any objections. Major Osei, your materials will be logged by the court clerk before noon. We reconvene at 1:15. He picked up the gavel. And I will remind everyone in this courtroom that I will not have my proceedings turned into a spectacle. Is that understood? It was not a question. The room they were given for the lunch break was small, a conference room on the 3rd floor that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. There was a table with 6 chairs, a whiteboard with something half erased on it, and a narrow window overlooking the parking structure. Tommy was the one who closed the door. Marcus was the one who crossed the room and put his arms around Evelyn before anyone said anything, and she let him, standing in the circle of his arms with her face against his shoulder and her eyes shut. And she did not make a sound, and neither did he for a long moment. When he stepped back, his jaw was set in the way it got when he was working to keep something contained. You should have called me in November, he said. I know. November, Mom, when the first notice came. I know, Marcus. You knew what this was. You knew they were... I know. She said it firmly enough that he stopped. She looked at all 3 of them. Daniel had his folder open on the table. Tommy was setting up a laptop. They both looked up when she spoke again. I know I should have called sooner. I didn't, and I'm not going to pretend I had a better reason than not wanting to worry you. That was a mistake. I'm past it. Are we past it? A beat. Then Daniel said, yes. Tommy said, yeah. Marcus took a breath through his nose. Yes. Good. She sat down. Then tell me what you have. What they had was more than she'd expected, and she had expected quite a lot. Daniel spread the contents of the folder across the table in the organized way of someone who had done this many times and knew the value of a clear sequence. There were documents, some printed, some flagged with color-coded tabs, and 2 USB drives and a transcript that was at least 40 pages thick. Start with the social services file, Daniel said, mostly to Evelyn, because Delacroix was reading over her shoulder and needed the same ground covered. Louise Petrie, the caseworker who told you the case wasn't moving. We tracked her down 6 months ago. She's retired, living in Sudbury. She agreed to a recorded statement. You've been working on this for 6 months? 8, Marcus said from the window. He hadn't sat down. Since Tommy flagged the Caldwell Group's property filings. Tommy looked up from the laptop. They filed for the Magnolia Street properties in March last year. Standard redevelopment application. But 3 of the names on the approval committee matched names on a donor list for Hale's judicial reappointment campaign. He said it the way he said most things, flat, precise, like he was reading coordinates. That's not illegal by itself. But it was enough to start pulling. The Petrie statement, Daniel case, wasn't administrative. She says directly, on record, that her supervisor at the time, a man named Greer, told her the case was to be held in ongoing status indefinitely. His exact words, as she recalls them, were that finalizing the placement would create a paper trail that certain people didn't want. Evelyn looked at the transcript. Certain people. She didn't know all the names at the time, but she remembered Greer mentioning the Housing Authority. And the Housing Authority in Riverton, in those years, shared 2 board members with the Development Office. Delacroix set down the page he was reading. The same development office that later became a subsidiary of the Caldwell Group. Correct, Daniel said. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, something beeped in the parking structure, a single flat sound. So they kept the case open deliberately, Evelyn said slowly. Left me in legal limbo. Let me claim benefits I thought I had the right to claim. Let the boys stay with me because there was nowhere else for them to go. And then they held the whole thing in reserve. Like a trap, Marcus said. Like leverage, Daniel corrected. They didn't need to use it as long as you weren't in their way. But when the Caldwell Group wanted Magnolia Street and you wouldn't sell, they had 19 years of benefit payments sitting in a file somewhere. They had everything they needed to make you look like a criminal instead of a woman they'd failed. Evelyn pressed her fingertips to the edge of the table. She didn't speak for a moment. It wasn't shock. She'd suspected most of this, had turned it over in her mind at night more times than she could count. But hearing it laid out like this, in a room with documents and transcripts and her 3 boys around a table, made it land differently. Made it real in a way that her own suspicions hadn't quite managed. The recording, she said. Daniel looked at her. What? Marcus said there was a recording. On the phone last week. He said something about a recording. Marcus and Daniel exchanged a look. Tommy closed the laptop partway. That's the part we need to talk about, Daniel said carefully. The recording was 11 minutes and 43 seconds long. It was an audio file recovered from a backup server that a former city IT contractor, a man named Bertram Q, who had left the city's employ under contested circumstances in 2009, had kept, apparently out of personal self-preservation instinct, on an encrypted external drive that had been sitting in a storage unit in Hamilton for 15 years. Tommy had found Q through a chain of digital forensics contacts, people who knew someone who'd worked with the city back then. It had taken 4 months and 2 formal records requests and 1 very long drive to Hamilton. The recording was of a phone call. Both speakers were identified via voice analysis comparison with publicly available recordings, a process Tommy had documented thoroughly and which, Daniel said, would stand up in court. One of the voices was Greer, the social services supervisor. The other was a man named Victor Hale. At the time of the recording, Hale was not yet a judge. He was a senior partner at a law firm that had provided legal counsel to the Riverton Housing Development Authority. In the recording, Greer asked what to do about the Brooks file, a woman who had been caring for 3 boys without formal status and kept coming in asking about the paperwork. Hale's answer, as Evelyn heard it when Tommy pressed play on the laptop, was clear and unhurried. Leave it open. She's not going anywhere, and neither are the kids. If the status stays undefined, it stays manageable. If it gets formalized, it becomes a problem for people who don't need problems right now. You understand what I'm saying? Greer said he understood. Good, said Hale's voice. Then it stays open. Tommy pressed stop. The room was very quiet. Delacroix was staring at the laptop. He said, "That's the judge." "That's the judge," Daniel confirmed. He deliberately ensured the case was never resolved. He ensured it stayed unresolved in a way that created criminal exposure for my mother while protecting the people who'd failed to act. For 19 years. Delacroix put both hands flat on the table. He looked at Evelyn. "This changes everything." Evelyn looked at the laptop. She thought about the crossword she'd been doing the night before, filling in boxes with a pen that was running low on ink. She thought about sitting at her kitchen table for 19 years helping boys do their homework, while somewhere in a filing cabinet, a phone call was ensuring she could be made into a criminal at the moment it became convenient. "Does it change anything for the boys?" she said. "Legally, does any of this create a problem for Marcus or Daniel or Tommy?" The question surprised Delacroix. It didn't surprise her sons. Marcus looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exasperated and something softer underneath. "Mom, I'm asking seriously." "We've been over this," Daniel said. "The records request was entirely lawful. The Q cooperation was voluntary. Tommy's analysis is documented and replicable. There's no chain of custody issue." He paused. "We're not the ones who did something wrong here." She nodded. She picked up the transcript and looked at it without reading it. "All right," she said. "What happens at 1:15? What happened at 1:15 was controlled chaos by courtroom standards." Fitch objected to the submission of the Petrie statement on the grounds that it was hearsay. Daniel cited the exception for prior consistent statements and prior recorded recollection. Hale overruled the objection with a flatness that suggested he'd known it was coming and had already decided. Fitch objected to the Q recording on chain of custody grounds. Tommy was called briefly to the stand to walk through his retrieval and analysis process, and he did it in the careful, granular way of a man who expected every step to be scrutinized and had made sure every step could bear it. Fitch tried twice more to interrupt the process and was overruled both times. The recording played in open court. Hale's face, when his own voice came through the laptop speakers, did something Evelyn had not quite predicted. She had expected anger or denial, or the controlled blankness of a man in a defensive position. What she saw instead was a brief, involuntary stillness, a fraction of a second in which something behind his eyes moved, recalibrated, and then settled into an expression she recognized from her years of nursing. It was the expression people got when they had known something was coming and had spent a long time telling themselves it wouldn't arrive. It had arrived. The jury heard every word. The gallery heard every word. Priya Anand's pen moved across the page so fast Evelyn could hear the scratch of it from where she sat. When the recording ended, the room stayed silent for 3, 4, 5 seconds, longer than rooms usually managed. Then everything happened at once. Fitch was on his feet. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate evidentiary hearing before any further—" "Sit down, Mr. Fitch." Hale's voice was completely level. That was the wrong kind of level. The kind that came from a man using all available resources to keep himself from showing the rest of the room that the floor had just shifted under him. "Your Honor, the prosecution has a right to keep—" "Sit down." Fitch sat. Hale looked at Daniel. "Major Osei, the voice analysis documentation, is it included in the submitted materials?" "It is, Your Honor. All 17 pages, including the methodology comparison and confidence intervals." A long pause. "The court will take the recording and associated materials under advisement." He looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are instructed not to draw conclusions from the submitted evidence until it has been formally admitted. This court will recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow, at which time we will address the admissibility of all newly submitted materials." He brought down the gavel. People started moving, talking, gathering their things, and in the noise of it, Evelyn watched Hale step down from the bench and walk toward the door that led to his chambers. He walked steadily. He did not look back. But just before he reached the door, one of the court officers, a young man Evelyn had seen both days, the one who always stationed himself near the rear wall, stepped forward and said something quietly to another officer near the door. The second officer nodded once and moved, not towards the exit, toward the bench, toward the door Hale had just used. It was a small thing, a short conversation. But Evelyn had spent 31 years in a hospital learning to read the small things that preceded the large ones. The slight change in a patient's color before the monitors alarmed, the careful way a doctor held a chart when the news in it wasn't good, the moment when the ordinary texture of a room changed and what came next would be different from what had come before. She looked at Marcus. He was watching the same door. "What's happening?" she asked. He glanced at her. His expression was the measured one. The one she'd learned meant he knew more than he was saying and was making a decision about how much to say. "Tommy made some additional calls this morning," he said, "before we came in." "What kind of calls?" "The kind that go to people who have jurisdiction over judges." She looked at the door again. The first officer was still standing near it, waiting. "Marcus." "Mom." "What did Tommy do?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, then, "What needed to be done? A while ago." She looked at him for a long beat, then she turned back to the front of the room, where Daniel was speaking quietly with Delacroix, and Tommy was packing the laptop into its case with his usual methodical care, and Priya Anand was on her phone near the gallery door with the focused expression of someone calling in a story before someone else could. From somewhere in the corridor beyond the courtroom, clear even through the walls and the noise of the room, there were footsteps. Not one person, several, moving at a pace that was not urgent but was not casual either. The door at the rear of the chambers did not open again. The footsteps in the corridor did not stop at the courtroom door. They passed it, continued down the hall toward the judge's wing, and then there was a sound that Evelyn couldn't quite identify. Not loud, not dramatic, more like a door being opened with authority rather than forced, and then nothing. The corridor went quiet. The courtroom itself was still moving, people gathering bags, talking in low clusters, the court officers doing the routine work of clearing the space. Nobody else seemed to have registered the footsteps as anything except background noise. But Marcus had. And Tommy, who had the laptop case buckled and in hand, was watching the door to chambers with an expression of careful neutrality that Evelyn knew meant he was tracking something. "Tommy," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Who did you call?" A beat. "The Judicial Conduct Commission. 3 weeks ago." He said it without apology and without particular emphasis, the way he delivered most information, as a fact that existed independent of anyone's feelings about it. "And the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, and a contact at the RCMP's Public Integrity Unit." She absorbed that. 3 weeks ago. "We wanted to make sure the timeline was solid before we filed. If Hale was going to recuse himself voluntarily, that window closed when the trial started." He paused. "He didn't recuse himself." "No," she said. "He didn't." Daniel was beside her now, already moving toward the door. "We need to go. There's going to be media outside within the next 20 minutes, and I'd rather you not be standing on the steps when it starts." She let herself be moved. That was the word for it. Not pushed, not led, but moved, the way the current of a room carries you when you stop resisting it. She picked up her coat and her bag and followed her sons out through the side corridor and into the afternoon. The car was a rented SUV parked 2 blocks from the courthouse, and by the time they reached it, Priya Anand had already posted the first item. Not a full story, just a breaking tag, and 3 sentences on the Tribune's site. Tommy checked it on his phone while Marcus drove and read it aloud without inflection. Riverton fraud trial suspended after military officers submit recorded evidence implicating presiding judge. Judge Victor Hale under review by Judicial Conduct Commission. Trial to resume tomorrow with new presiding judge. "That's fast," Delacroix said from the back seat. "She had the recording," Daniel said, "same as everyone in that room." Evelyn was looking out the window at Magnolia Street as they passed it. The hoardings were still up on the south end. The Caldwell Group logo, dark green against white board, facing the street. Her house was on the north end of the block, and it came into view for a moment. The front porch, the garden that was past season now, bare and brown. The light she'd left on above the door that morning before the car came to take her to court. She looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure you'll keep. "Who's the new judge?" she asked. Daniel checked something on his phone. The assignment hasn't been posted yet. We'll know by morning. Is it someone we should be worried about? Honestly, we don't know enough to say, but the materials are filed. The recording is in evidence. The Petrie statement is in evidence. Whoever comes in tomorrow has to work with what's already on record. She turned away from the window. And Fitch? Fitch has a problem, Daniel said. He built his entire case on the paperwork trail without looking at how the paperwork was created. Now that the how is in question, his evidence doesn't disappear, but its context changes. A good defense argues that the benefit claims weren't fraudulent because the underlying situation was fraudulently managed, which is what we're arguing. Can you win that argument? Yes, he said. I think we can. He said it with the same measured tone he used for everything, but Evelyn had raised him, and she knew the difference between his confident even and his working to sound confident even. This was the former. It was a small thing, but it was real, and it mattered. That night, the three of them stayed in the house on Magnolia Street. It was the first time all three had been there simultaneously in almost 4 years. Evelyn made the dinner she always made when Marcus came home, rice and stew, the recipe she'd improvised the third week they were with her when she'd run out of the groceries she knew how to use and had to work with what was in the cupboard, and somehow it had become the thing they asked for. Marcus set the table without being asked. Tommy washed his hands twice, which was a habit from the forensics work, and then felt compelled to explain this to no one in particular. Daniel sat at the counter with his folder open and then closed it, which for Daniel was the equivalent of declaring a ceasefire. They ate mostly without talking. The television was off. Outside, the street was quiet. Partway through dinner, Tommy said, "The RCMP unit that handles public integrity. They're not just looking at Hale." Marcus looked at him. "They've opened a preliminary inquiry into the Caldwell Group's application process. The 3 names on the approval committee. There may be 2 others in the housing authority we don't know about yet." Delacroix, who had stayed for dinner at Evelyn's insistence and was sitting slightly awkwardly at the end of the table like a man not sure whether he was a guest or a colleague, said, "How preliminary is preliminary?" "Preliminary means they're looking, not charging." Tommy picked up his fork. "Yet. What's your confidence level on that changing?" Tommy considered it in his methodical way. "High. They don't open preliminaries on this kind of thing without something to anchor it. The anchor here is the recording. Hale was a private attorney advising a development board when he made it. That makes it a conspiracy to obstruct, potentially, across 2 decades. That's not a small thing for them to leave on a shelf," Daniel said, without looking up from his stew. "Don't front-run the investigation." "I'm not front-running, I'm assessing." "Those are not always different things." Tommy looked at him. "I'm aware." Evelyn watched them without intervening. She had never intervened in arguments between them when they were boys, not unless it was heading somewhere that required stopping. This wasn't. This was just them, the way they worked, the friction that happened between careful people when the stakes were high and the variables uncertain. She'd learned a long time ago that the friction was actually what kept them calibrated. "Eat," she said. They ate. At Nina 14 the next morning, the courtroom felt different. The bench was set up identically. The gallery was, if anything, more full than either previous day, but the weight in the room had shifted in a way Evelyn could feel before anyone said anything. There were 4 people in the front row she didn't recognize, 2 women and 2 men, all of them with the specific quality of stillness that came from institutional training. Not military. Something adjacent. Government, she thought. The new judge entered at 9:17. Her name, as announced by the clerk, was the Honorable Margaret Okafor, and she came in the way people come in when they have read the file before arriving, quickly, without ceremony, already moving toward the next task. She was in her 50s, dark-skinned, with close-cut natural hair and reading glasses she put on before she even reached the bench. She sat. She looked at both tables. She looked at the gallery with an expression that communicated clearly that she had been given a situation and had formed a complete opinion about it and was here to resolve it rather than extend it. "I've reviewed the materials submitted yesterday," she said without preamble. "I have questions for both counsel before we proceed. Mr. Fitch." She turned to the prosecution table. "Your case was built on a determination of legal status, specifically that the accused held no legal guardian status over the 3 minors and therefore had no legal basis to claim associated benefits." "That is correct, Your Honor." The submitted materials include a documented statement from a former department caseworker alleging that the accused's case was deliberately held in unresolved status by individuals with a material interest in it remaining unresolved. If that allegation is substantiated, and I'm not saying it is, I'm saying if, does your legal status argument survive? Fitch's pause was brief but visible. Your Honor, the allegation, even if substantiated, does not change the factual record of the accused's legal status at the time of benefit collection. It may change the question of intent, Okafor said, which is central to a fraud charge. The prosecution's position is that intent to deceive can be, I know what the prosecution's position is, Mr. Fitch. I've read your filings. She said it without heat. I'm asking whether your legal status argument survives a successful challenge to the circumstances under which that status was withheld. Another pause. We would argue that it does, Your Honor. Noted. She moved to Daniel. Major Osei. The recorded audio. The voice analysis methodology. Has it been independently reviewed? Yes, Your Honor. The analysis was conducted by our forensic specialist and peer-reviewed by a second analyst at a civilian firm in Toronto. Both reports are in the submission. And the chain of custody for the original recording. Documented in full. The original file was maintained by Bertram Q on an encrypted drive from 2009 to the present, with no alterations. The file metadata confirms creation date and zero modification history. Mr. Q's affidavit confirming this is included. Okafor was quiet for a moment, reading something in front of her. The room was very still. Evelyn had the sensation of watching someone do something precise and irreversible, the way she'd watched surgeons during the years when she'd worked in recovery. The moment just before a critical decision, when the outcome was still uncertain, but the decision itself was already made. I'm going to allow the submitted materials, Okafor said. Mr. Fitch, your objections are noted and preserved for appeal. This court is going to proceed with the full evidentiary record as it now stands. She looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you will be receiving materials today that were not part of the original prosecution case. I want to be very clear with you. Your job is to weigh the evidence in its entirety, all of it, what you heard before yesterday and what you will hear today. She paused. We'll begin. What began was a 3-hour examination that Evelyn would later think of not as a courtroom proceeding, but as a process of excavation. Layer by layer, the material surfaced what had been buried. Daniel called Louise Petrie's recorded statement first. Petrie herself was not in person, but the recording was played through the court's speaker system, and her voice, older now and careful with its words, filled the room with the particular texture of someone who had held something for a long time and had finally decided the holding was more costly than the release. She described Greer's instructions. She described the meetings, the language used, the fact that she had been told the Brooks case was to remain in ongoing status indefinitely, and that this instruction had come from above her supervisor's level. She described being told, when she pushed for clarification, that there were legal considerations she wasn't cleared to know about. She described leaving the department 2 years later and carrying the knowledge for the rest of her working life, and not knowing what to do with it until someone from a forensics unit called her in Sudbury and asked her to put it on record. I knew it was wrong, her recorded voice said. I knew when Greer told me, and I knew every year after. I told myself there was nothing I could do. That's not true. There was always something I could have done. I just didn't do it. The room was silent when the recording ended. Fitch's cross-examination of the statement was careful, but couldn't undo it. He challenged the specificity of the dates, challenged whether Petrie's recollection could be trusted after so many years, and challenged whether Greer's instructions necessarily implied the kind of orchestrated suppression the defense was alleging. Daniel's redirect was one question. Had Louise Petrie ever previously made these claims publicly in any venue before the record's request? The answer, per the submitted documentation, was no. There was no prior inconsistency. There was nothing to suggest the statement was constructed rather than recalled. Then Tommy took the stand for a second time, this time to walk through the analysis of the Caldwell Group's property filing records, which he had cross-referenced against a series of financial documents obtained through a parallel records request by a separate legal team, a civil firm in Toronto retained by 2 of the other Magnolia Street residents who had already lost their homes and were now watching Evelyn's trial with very specific interest. What the cross-reference showed was not subtle. The three names on the Riverton Housing Approval Committee had each received, in the 18 months preceding the Caldwell Group's application approval, a series of payments from a numbered holding company. The holding company, once unspooled through 3 layers of corporate structure, traced back to a real estate trust whose primary beneficiaries were the principals of the Caldwell Group. It was not conclusive proof of bribery. Tommy said that clearly because he had been trained to say what the evidence showed and not what it might imply. But it was 3 payments, 3 officials, 1 approval, and a paper trail that did not exist by accident. The gallery had stopped moving during this portion. Even the sounds of shifted weight and rustled papers had stopped. The 4 people in the front row were writing continuously. Fitch objected to the relevance of the financial records to the fraud charge against Evelyn. Okafor sustained the objection in part. The jury was instructed that the financial records were admitted as contextual evidence relating to the alleged systemic suppression of the accused's legal status, not as direct evidence of the charge. But admitted was admitted, and 12 people had now seen those numbers. At 12:45, Okafor called a lunch recess. She stood before the room did, which was protocol, but as she moved toward her chambers she paused, only for a moment, and said without directing it at anyone specifically, "We will reconvene at 2 p.m. I expect both counsel to be prepared for closing argument scheduling." Closing arguments. Moving toward the end. Evelyn was in the 3rd floor conference room again, but she wasn't eating. She was standing at the narrow window looking down at the parking structure. Below, near the entrance to the building, she could see a cluster of people, reporters, she thought, and 2 vehicles she didn't recognize, dark and unmarked, the kind that appeared in government contexts. Daniel was on his phone. Marcus was reviewing something on Tommy's laptop. Tommy was eating a granola bar he'd produced from somewhere and looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man running calculations. Delacroix came in last, slightly out of breath. He sat down, loosened his tie by a fraction, and said, "I just spoke to one of the clerk's assistants." Everyone looked at him. "There's a process server in the building. He's been here since this morning." He paused. "He's not here for Evelyn." Marcus said, "Hail." "And 2 of the committee members, the civil team in Toronto, they filed this morning." The room absorbed that. A civil suit on top of the criminal inquiry, on top of the Conduct Commission review. The Caldwell Group's application approval was now being challenged from 3 different directions simultaneously, and the central figure in all of it, the man who had sat on that bench 2 days ago looking at Evelyn over his reading glasses, was no longer sitting on any bench at all. "How is he?" Evelyn asked. The question surprised everyone, including, she suspected, herself. But she wanted to know. Not from sympathy. She was not at a place where sympathy was available for Victor Hale, but because she had spent 31 years in medicine and she had learned that understanding what was happening to the people around her was not the same as caring about it. It was just information. Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Suspended, pending the conduct review. He was formally notified this morning before court." He paused. "I imagine he's not doing well." She nodded. That was enough. At 1:58, Evelyn walked back into the courtroom. The gallery was full to capacity, and there were 2 people standing at the back who hadn't been able to find seats. Priya Anand was in the same spot she'd been in for 3 days, 2nd row left, notebook on her knee, pen in hand. Okafor took the bench exactly at 2. "Before we proceed to closing argument scheduling," she said, "I have one additional matter." She looked at Fitch. "The prosecution has filed a motion to withdraw the fraud charge." Evelyn's breath stopped. "I've reviewed the motion," Okafor continued. "Given the evidentiary record as it currently stands, and the documented evidence that the accused's inability to formalize her legal status was the direct result of deliberate administrative suppression by individuals with conflicts of interest, the prosecution has determined that proceeding is not in the interest of justice." She looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to discharge you from this case. The charge against Evelyn Brooks is withdrawn with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled. Ms. Brooks is free to go." The gallery erupted. It was not the organized sound of applause. It was the sudden, uncontrolled noise of a room full of people who had been holding something and let it go all at once. Exclamations, a few people clapping, someone near the back saying something emphatic that got swallowed by the general sound. Priya Anand stopped writing and looked up. One of the court officers at the side wall allowed herself a small, private exhale. Evelyn sat completely still. Delacroix turned to her. He said something she didn't quite hear over the noise. She looked at him and he repeated it. "It's over." She turned to her left. Daniel was already standing, and Tommy beside him, and Marcus had moved from his position along the wall and was standing at the edge of the gallery railing closest to her. His expression was the one she knew least, the one that didn't have a name, the one that had appeared only a handful of times in 31 years. And each time it had taken her a moment to recognize it, because Marcus so rarely allowed himself the full range of what he felt. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her when he was 9 years old, standing in her kitchen the morning she'd told him he could stay. That same look. Older face, different room, same thing underneath. Okafor brought the gavel down twice, and the room began to settle. She was speaking again. Procedural instructions about the discharge of the jury, something about the court record. But Evelyn was watching Marcus, and Marcus was watching her, and for that moment the room and the noise and the 2 decades of accumulated wrong didn't exist. Then Okafor said something that changed the temperature of the room again. "Before this court is adjourned," she said, and her voice had shifted, not softer, but more deliberate. "I want to note for the record that the evidentiary materials submitted in this case have been forwarded to the appropriate oversight bodies." She looked directly at the prosecution table. "Mr. Fitch, the court expects your cooperation with any subsequent inquiries." Fitch looked up from his documents. Something moved across his face. "Additionally," Okafor said, "the court has received notification that the Ontario Public Prosecution Service is opening a separate inquiry into the conduct of these proceedings from their initiation." She paused. "That inquiry will determine how this case was assembled, by whom, and for what purpose." The room had gone very quiet again. Not the full gallery inquiry, not just Hale. The prosecution itself, the mechanism that had taken 19 years of paperwork and shaped it into a criminal charge and walked a 71-year-old woman into a courthouse in handcuffs. Fitch was still. His assistant beside him was still. The 4 people in the front row were writing again, faster than before. Evelyn looked at Fitch. He did not look back at her. He was staring at the surface of the prosecution table, and his expression had the specific quality of a man calculating, very quickly, how much trouble he was in. The answer, Evelyn thought, was probably a great deal. Okafor brought down the gavel one final time. "This court is adjourned." And Evelyn Ann Brooks stood up from the defense table for the last time and turned toward her sons, and behind her, somewhere in the administrative corridors of the Riverton courthouse, a printer produced 12 copies of a formal inquiry notice addressed to Gerald Fitch, and at the same moment, in a quiet office 4 blocks away, Victor Hale's personal attorney received a call from the RCMP's Public Integrity Unit requesting an immediate meeting at a time that was not a request. The call to Hale's attorney lasted 11 minutes. Tommy knew this because the Public Integrity Unit had informed Daniel of the meeting request as a professional courtesy. A heads up that the inquiry was moving faster than standard procedure, which meant the materials Tommy had submitted were being taken seriously at a level that went above the unit's regional desk. The 11-minute duration was something Tommy learned later, from a contact at the unit who had been present in the room and would not say anything on record but was willing to confirm the basics off it. 11 minutes was not long. It was long enough. What happened in those 11 minutes reconstructed from what surfaced over the following 72 hours. Hale's attorney, a criminal defense specialist named Aldrich Purves, brought in fast, expensive, clearly someone Hale had a relationship with before any of this began, told the unit that his client would not be providing a voluntary interview. The unit thanked him for his time. The meeting ended. And within an hour, a formal production order was filed with the Ontario Superior Court requiring Hale to produce all personal and professional communications, financial records, and calendar documentation from a period spanning 18 years. 18 years. Not the 19 of Evelyn's benefit claims. 18. Starting from the year after the phone call with Greer, extending to the present. Daniel explained this to Evelyn that evening at the kitchen table while Marcus stood at the counter and Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor with the laptop open, monitoring 3 separate news feeds simultaneously. "They're not starting from the recording," Daniel said. "They're starting from what came after it, what Hale did with the arrangement once it was in place." "Which was what exactly?" "We don't have the full picture yet. But the Caldwell Group's incorporation documents go back further than we initially thought. The holding company that made the payments to the committee members, it was established in the same year as that phone call. Evelyn looked at her tea. He wasn't just protecting someone else's arrangement, he was part of building it. That's what the 18-year window suggests. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the street was dark. The hoardings were still up on the south end of the block, but she had stopped looking at them 2 days ago as anything other than a temporary condition. "What about Fitch?" she asked. "Different situation. Fitch is a prosecutor, not a judge. The Public Prosecution Service inquiry is internal. They're looking at whether he knew what he was using and used it anyway, or whether he was handed a case file and prosecuted in good faith." "Do you think he knew?" Daniel considered this with his usual care. "I think he knew enough to look more carefully than he did. Whether that's willful blindness or something more active, that's what they'll determine." "And the committee members?" "Two have retained counsel. The third issued a public statement this afternoon saying he cooperated in full with the Caldwell application in good faith based on documentation presented to him and welcomes the opportunity to clarify." Tommy said this without looking up from the laptop. "Which means the third one is probably the least culpable and is trying to get ahead of the others before one of them starts talking." Marcus, still at the counter. "Someone will start talking." "Someone always does," Tommy said. "Oh." The Tribune ran Priya Anand's full piece the next morning. Not on the website, in print, which the Tribune still produced 3 days a week, and which still mattered in Riverton in a way that online-only outlets had not quite replaced. The piece ran front page, below the fold, with a headline that was factual to the point of being almost restrained. "Riverton fraud case dismissed. Documents reveal decades of deliberate administrative suppression." It was 6,000 words. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of tea, slowly. Priya had gotten the essential facts right: the charges, the dismissal, the recording, the Petrie statement, the financial cross-reference. She had also, with the particular instinct of a journalist who knew that facts alone rarely told the whole story, included a paragraph that Evelyn read twice. "What the documents cannot fully capture is the particular cruelty of the mechanism used." Evelyn Brooks did not simply fall through cracks in a system. The cracks were kept open for her, maintained over nearly 2 decades, by people who understood that an unresolved legal status was more useful to them as a liability held in reserve than as a problem solved. She raised 3 children in that gap. She built a life in it. And when the gap was finally weaponized against her, the weapon carried the full authority of the state. Evelyn folded the paper. She didn't have a word for what she felt reading that paragraph. Something between recognition and grief. And underneath both of those, something older and harder that was not quite anger, but was in the same family. She did not cry. She had cried once, in November, alone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night after the first notice arrived. A single hard bout of it that lasted about 4 minutes and left her feeling scraped clean. She hadn't cried since. She wasn't sure she had anything left for it. Tommy came downstairs at 7:30, took one look at the folded paper, and poured himself coffee without saying anything. That was the right call. She appreciated it. The Caldwell Group issued a statement through their communications firm at 10 a.m. It was 4 paragraphs long and used the words "deeply committed to transparency" twice and "standard compliance processes" once, and did not mention Victor Hale, Gerald Fitch, the approval committee, the holding company, or Evelyn Brooks by name. It concluded by saying the organization welcomed the opportunity to cooperate with any regulatory review. Marcus read it on his phone and said, "That's a company that already knows what's coming and is trying to soften the landing." They were in the living room. Daniel was on a call in the spare room. Tommy was at the kitchen table with the laptop. The house felt different with all 3 of them in it. Fuller, louder, in the particular way of people who knew each other well enough to be themselves without effort. Evelyn had not lived with that particular quality of noise in the house for years, and she was aware of it as a thing she had missed without fully realizing she was missing it. "Will they succeed?" she asked. "Softening it. Depends on what the RCMP finds and how fast they find it." Marcus set the phone down. "The holding company is the key. If they can trace it cleanly to Caldwell's principles, not just the trust, all the way to the people making decisions, then the bribery case is structural, not incidental. That's not something you soft land." "How long does that take?" "Months, maybe longer." He looked at her. This isn't going to resolve in a week, Mom. I want you to understand that. The criminal inquiry, the conduct commission, the prosecution review, these move at their own pace. You might be fully vindicated in the public record long before the legal processes finish. I know, and some of the people involved may never face the consequences that Marcus. She said it the same way she always said his name when he was working himself up towards something she didn't need him to say. I know. I've been alive long enough to know how these things go. I'm not expecting it to be complete. She paused. I'm expecting it to be more than nothing. That's different. He nodded, looked at his hands. Yeah, that is different. 3 days after the dismissal, Desmond Ragg, the Deputy Director of Child and Family Services, who had testified in the first half of the trial about the lack of formal placement records, resigned. The resignation was announced by the ministry in a single-sentence statement that said nothing about the circumstances. But Priya Anand, who had apparently not slept since the trial ended, published a follow-up piece 24 hours later that cited 2 anonymous sources within the ministry, confirming that Ragg had been asked to resign in the context of the ongoing inquiry and had complied rather than face a formal suspension. The piece also noted, in its 4th paragraph, that the ministry was conducting an internal review of how the Brooks file had been handled within the department, and that at least 2 other caseworkers from the relevant period had been contacted by investigators. The investigation was widening, not just up, toward Hale and the committee, but sideways, into the institutional tissue that had made the arrangement possible. The people who had followed instructions without asking what the instructions were for. The people who had known something was being held in a state it shouldn't have been in and had processed their discomfort, and continued. Evelyn thought about Louise Petrie in Sudbury, who had held it for 15 years before finally letting it go. She thought about what that kind of holding cost a person. She did not think about it with contempt. She had spent enough time in medicine to understand that moral courage and institutional pressure existed in genuine tension, and that the people who failed the test were not always the people who deserved the most judgment. Some of them were, but not all. On the 4th day, Gerald Fitch's name appeared in a legal notice filed in the Superior Court. Not criminal, civil, a suit brought by the civil firm representing 2 of the other Magnolia Street residents who had already sold under pressure before Evelyn's case went to trial. The suit named Fitch as a defendant, alongside 3 Caldwell Group officials and 2 of the approval committee members, alleging conspiracy to use prosecutorial machinery as a tool of property coercion. It was a broad claim. Civil suits usually were, at filing. But the claim was now in the public record, and Fitch's name was attached to it, and that was its own category of consequence, one that didn't require a conviction to do damage. Evelyn learned about it from Tommy, who delivered information the way he delivered most things, factually, in the right sequence, without editorializing. She listened. She asked one question. Is he going to countersue? His attorney has indicated he's focused on the Public Prosecution Service inquiry first. Tommy closed the laptop partway. He's not going to countersue a civil claim while a parallel professional review is open. Too much discovery exposure. So he's cornered. On 2 sides. 3. If the RCMP's inquiry expands to include the prosecution's role in the original case assembly. He paused. Which it might. Might, she said. Tommy doesn't say will when he means probably, Marcus said from the other side of the room. He never has. I said high confidence, Tommy said mildly. Probably means will, Marcus said. Tommy picked up his coffee. Probably. Woke up. On the 5th day, Victor Hale's photograph appeared on the front page of the Toronto Star. Not the Tribune. The Star, which was the kind of placement that meant the story had crossed out of local significance into something larger. The piece was longer than Priya's and had 3 bylines and covered the Riverton case as one thread in a broader examination of the relationship between judicial appointments, private legal work, and development interests in mid-sized Ontario cities over the past 2 decades. Hale's name appeared in the 2nd paragraph and did not leave the piece. The photograph was from a bar association event. Formal, well-lit, Hale with his reading glasses on the table in front of him, and his expression carrying the specific gravity of a man accustomed to being the most authoritative person in the room. The caption below it read, Victor Hale, former Riverton judge, suspended pending judicial conduct review and RCMP inquiry. Former. That word had been added within the past 48 hours. The Conduct Commission had moved faster than anyone had anticipated, and what they'd found in their preliminary review, Evelyn did not know all the details, and Daniel was careful about what he shared that came from professional contacts, had been sufficient to accelerate the suspension from pending review to effectively permanent, pending a formal removal hearing that everyone with knowledge of the process said was a formality at this point. The Caldwell Group's share in 3 active development projects was frozen by court order pending the RCMP's financial investigation. The company's communications firm released 2 more statements in 48 hours, each slightly more conciliatory than the last, which was the language of an organization whose lawyers had told them the situation was worse than they'd initially assessed. One of the 2 committee members who had retained counsel, a man named Philip Astor, who had served on the approval committee as a housing authority board appointee, appeared briefly at a press scrum outside his office building and said he had fully cooperated with investigators, had provided all requested documentation, and had acted in good faith based on information available to him. He looked like a man who had rehearsed the statement and was aware it was not enough. The 3rd committee member, the one who had issued the early public statement welcoming the opportunity to clarify, had not appeared publicly since. His attorney confirmed he was cooperating fully with the inquiry. He was reportedly in conversation with the prosecution service about a possible immunity arrangement in exchange for testimony. Immunity arrangements, Daniel explained to Evelyn, were a good sign in the sense that they meant investigators had enough that someone inside the structure wanted to trade their way out of it. It means they have the shape of it, he said. They just need someone on the inside to fill in the details they can't get from documents. And if he talks, then the bribery case against the Caldwell principals becomes significantly easier to prosecute. And Hale's involvement in the original structure beyond the recording becomes easier to document. He paused, and Fitch's case gets harder to argue as good faith. On the 6th day, a letter arrived at 44 Magnolia Street. Not from a lawyer, not from the ministry, from the City of Riverton, office of the mayor, on official letterhead signed by the mayor himself, a man named Gerald Torn, who had been in office for 3 years and had, as far as Evelyn knew, no particular connection to any of the events of the past 3 weeks. The letter was short. It expressed on behalf of the city regret at the circumstances that had led to the prosecution of Evelyn Brooks, acknowledged that the city's administrative systems had failed to provide the legal status resolution she had repeatedly sought over a period of years, and stated the city's intention to formally review and correct the records relating to her guardianship of the 3 Osei minors for the relevant period. It did not use the word apology. Evelyn noticed that. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not with anger, but with the particular clear-eyed attention of someone who had learned that the shape of language was as informative as its content. No apology. Not yet. An expression of regret and an intention to review. She set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and took a photograph of it and sent it to all 3 boys without a caption. Marcus replied in under a minute. It's a start. Daniel. They need to do better than this. I'll draft a formal response. Tommy, after a slightly longer pause. Their legal team wrote regret because apology creates liability exposure. They know exactly what happened. They're just not ready to say so officially. She put the phone down. She looked at the letter again. Then she got up and put it in the drawer in the kitchen where she kept important documents, the same drawer where the boys' school records had lived for years, where their vaccination histories and report cards and the letters from their teachers had accumulated over 19 years of ordinary life. The drawer was full, had been for a long time. That evening, after dinner, after Daniel had gone back to his laptop and Tommy had taken a call from his unit and Marcus had stepped out to the back porch for air, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table alone for the first time in several days. The house was quiet in the particular way it got when people were in it, but not present, and she sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall across from her where there was a photograph she'd put up years ago, not framed properly, just pushed into a corner of the mirror that hung there. Of all 3 boys at some school event, Marcus in the back because he was already tall, Daniel in the middle looking at something off to the left of the frame, Tommy in the front squinting into the sun. She had not staged that photograph. She'd just taken it because they were standing there and she'd had her phone in her hand. From the back porch, she could hear Marcus on the phone with someone. his voice low and even, the careful professional voice, not the voice he used with her. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. What she heard instead, under his voice and the sounds of the house, was something that was not quite silence and not quite sound. The particular quality of a situation that had been in motion for a very long time and was now, finally, beginning to resolve. Not finished, not clean, but moving in a direction she could name. Then Marcus came back inside and closed the porch door behind him, and his expression when he came into the kitchen was not the measured one, and not the one with no name, but a third one she recognized less well. The one that appeared when something he'd been working toward for a long time had just taken a step he hadn't expected. "Who was that?" she asked. He sat down across from her. He put his phone on the table face down, which he only did when he wanted to give his full attention to something without distraction. "That was a contact at the Public Prosecution Service," he said. "Someone Daniel knows." He paused. "They found something in Fitch's case files, something from before the trial, a document that was present in his internal preparation materials but was not disclosed to the defense." Evelyn looked at him. "It's a memo," Marcus said, "from the city solicitor's office, dated 14 months ago. It outlines, in reasonable detail, the fact that the Brooks benefit case had been identified as a mechanism to facilitate property acquisition and that its success would depend on the defendant not having access to the department's internal communications history." The room was very quiet. "He had it before the trial started," Evelyn said. "He had it before the trial started." She sat with that. 14 months ago. Before the charges were formally filed, before the arraignment, before the discovery process, before any of the procedural machinery of the trial had begun. A document in Gerald Fitch's files describing her case not as a prosecution built on evidence of wrongdoing, but as a mechanism for something else entirely. "That's not prosecutorial negligence," she said. "No," Marcus said. "It's not." He looked at her across the table. In the spare room, Daniel's voice had stopped. Either the call had ended or he'd heard something. The quality of the house's silence had changed in the small way that it did when the people in it were paying attention. "Fitch knew," Evelyn said, not a question. "Fitch knew," Marcus said. "And tomorrow morning, Daniel is going to file a formal complaint with the Law Society of Ontario and send copies of the memo and the complaint to the RCMP unit and the Public Prosecution Service in Priya Anand at the Tribune simultaneously." From the spare room, the door opened. Daniel came into the kitchen with his phone in his hand and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected for a long time. "I got the same call," he said to Marcus. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Tomorrow's going to be a difficult day for Gerald Fitch." It was a difficult day for Gerald Fitch. Daniel filed the complaint at 8:51 in the morning, before most of the city's administrative offices had finished their first coffee. He sent it simultaneously to the Law Society of Ontario, the RCMP Public Integrity Unit, the Ontario Public Prosecution Services Oversight Division, and Priya Anand's personal email at the Tribune. He did not issue a press statement. He did not hold a press conference. He sent the files and the accompanying memo and a 3-paragraph cover letter that laid out the timeline with the precision of a man who had been trained to present evidence in a way that required the minimum possible interpretation from the reader. The memo spoke for itself. By 10:15, the Tribune had a breaking notice online. By 11, 3 other outlets had picked it up. By noon, the Law Society had issued a terse confirmation that a complaint had been received and a preliminary review was underway, which was faster than preliminary reviews usually moved and communicated something about the weight of what they'd received. Fitch's attorney released a statement at 1 p.m. It said his client maintained that he had acted at all times in accordance with his professional obligations and looked forward to addressing the complaint through the appropriate channels. It was 13 words longer than the Caldwell Group's first statement and contained roughly the same density of meaning. Evelyn did not read the statement. Tommy summarized it for her in one sentence, and she nodded and went back to her garden, which she'd been trying to rehabilitate for an hour, pulling the dead growth from the beds along the south wall of the house. The ground was still cold. The work was harder than it would have been in warmer months. She did it anyway because the garden had been neglected since November, and she was done letting things go unattended. Marcus came out and stood on the porch watching her for a while without speaking. She was aware of him there. After a few minutes, he came down the steps and crouched beside the nearest bed and started pulling without being asked. They worked in silence for most of it. Then Marcus said, "The RCMP unit contacted Daniel this morning, before the filing." She pulled a root free. "And?" "They've completed the financial trace on the holding company. It goes directly to two principals at Caldwell, not through subsidiaries. Direct." He paused. "They're moving to the charging stage." She sat back on her heels. The dirt on her gloves was cold and damp. "How long before formal charges?" "Weeks, not months. The unit wants it done before the Conduct Commission finishes its Hale review, so the timelines don't create procedural complications." "Is that normal, that speed?" "No." He pulled something and it came loose in a long tangle of dead root. "But this case hasn't been normal since the day 3 military officers walked into a courtroom and one of them introduced himself as someone's son." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden bed, not at her, and his expression had the quality it got when he was attempting to be matter-of-fact about something that was not, for him, matter-of-fact at all. She knew that quality well. She'd watched it develop in him from the age of 9, the armor he'd built so steadily and so early that by the time he was an adult, it was mostly seamless. Mostly. "Marcus." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. All three of you." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the garden. "Don't thank us. We're 30 years late. You were 9. Daniel was 7. Tommy was 4. He pulled another section of dead growth free. We didn't do anything for a long time. You were children. And then we weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "We had access to things and connections and skills. We had all of that for years before any of this happened. I could have looked harder, earlier. I knew something was wrong with your situation. I knew it when I was in college and I asked you about it and you said it was fine and I believed you because I wanted to, not because I should have." The honesty of it landed in the quiet between them. She let it sit there without filling it. "You're here now," she said. "Yeah." He pushed himself up from his crouch. "We are." The formal charges against the 2 Caldwell Group principals, Reginald Moss, chief executive, and Arthur Vane, head of acquisitions, were filed on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the dismissal of Evelyn's case. The charges included bribery of public officials, conspiracy to defraud, and saw added at the last stage of the investigation, based partly on the testimony of the 3rd committee member who had taken the immunity arrangement, obstruction of administrative process, in a manner that resulted in harm to a private individual. That last charge was new. Daniel had not expected it. When he called Evelyn to tell her, there was a pause in his voice that he did not try to conceal, which was unusual for Daniel, who concealed most things by reflex. "It means the investigation recognized that what happened to you wasn't incidental," he said. "It wasn't a side effect of their scheme. It was part of the mechanism." "I know," she said. "The harm to you was deliberate. They're charging it as deliberate." She was at the kitchen table with her tea. Outside, the Caldwell Group's hoardings had come down from the south end of Magnolia Street 2 weeks earlier, after the court order freezing the development projects had been extended, pending the criminal investigation. Without the hoardings, the street looked like itself again, older, a little worn, but continuous. The houses that had already come down were gone, and that was a fact that would not change. But the ones that remained were standing. "Daniel," she said, "are you all right?" A pause. "Yes." "You don't have to be." A longer pause. I'm fine. This is good news, Mom. This is a good day." "I know it is," she said. "I'm asking if you're all right." The pause that followed was different from the others, longer, and with a different texture. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly less even than usual, which for Daniel was the equivalent of a different person showing significant emotion. "I used to think about this case when I was in school," he said. "Law school, specifically. There was a professor who talked about the way institutional negligence could be weaponized, the way a system could fail someone and then turn the failure into evidence against them. And I sat in that class and I thought about your situation, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure I was understanding it correctly. I was 22 and I thought maybe I was projecting." A beat. "I wasn't projecting." "No," she said. "You weren't. I should have done something then. You were a student. I was a law student with a professor literally describing what had happened to my mother, and I sat there and took notes." She was quiet for a moment. Daniel, you're doing something now. He didn't respond immediately. Then, yeah, I know. That's enough. It really is. On. Victor Hale's formal removal hearing was held in a closed session by the Conduct Commission, which was standard practice. What was not standard was how quickly the commission reached its conclusion, and what was less standard still was the accompanying referral it made to the RCMP upon the hearing's completion, a referral that went beyond the original scope of the Judicial Conduct Review and formally documented the Commission's finding that Hale's conduct had constituted not merely a breach of judicial ethics but a pattern of behavior with potential criminal dimensions that the Commission's mandate did not extend to prosecuting. It passed that finding, with all supporting documentation, to the unit that was already building the case against Moss and Vane. Hale's removal was made public on a Friday afternoon in a 3-paragraph statement from the Commission that said he had been removed from judicial office with immediate effect and was ineligible for reappointment. The statement did not detail the specific findings. It didn't need to. The referral to the RCMP had been confirmed by a source to the Tribune that morning, and Priya Anand's piece on the removal, published within 40 minutes of the Commission's statement, included both the removal and the referral and the context that connected them to the Evelyn Brooks case and to the Caldwell Group investigation. The piece's final paragraph noted that the recording made 18 years ago by the man who had just been removed from judicial office had been entered into the RCMP's evidentiary record and was expected to form a central component of the prosecution's case against him. His own words, used against him. 18 years after he'd spoken them into a phone, believing the conversation was private and consequenceless. Evelyn read that paragraph standing at the kitchen counter. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and finished making dinner. The civil suit brought by the 2 Magnolia Street residents settled 6 weeks after that. The settlement terms were confidential, as civil settlements almost always were, but the Toronto firm that had brought the case issued a statement saying the outcome fully addressed their clients' losses. Priya Anand, who had a source somewhere in the process, wrote a short follow-up piece describing the settlement as substantial without specifying an amount, and noting that it included a public acknowledgement from the Caldwell Group that its acquisition process in Riverton had involved the use of information obtained through improper channels. Improper channels. Corporate language for the deliberate, years-long suppression of a woman's legal status in order to hold her exposed to criminal prosecution at the moment it became financially convenient. But it was an acknowledgement, in a document with signatures on it. A week after the settlement, Evelyn received a second letter from the city. This one was longer than the first and did not avoid the word she'd noticed was missing before. It used it 4 times. It outlined the formal steps the city was taking to correct the administrative record. The guardianship records for Marcus, Daniel, and Tommy Osei were being retroactively documented as legally recognized for the relevant period, on the basis that the failure to formalize that status had been the result of deliberate administrative interference, rather than any deficiency on Evelyn's part. Her pension, which had been partially withheld during the period of active prosecution, was being restored in full, with arrears. And the city was establishing, in consultation with its Humanitarian Awards Committee, a recognition ceremony. She read the letter at the kitchen table the same way she'd read the first one, carefully, looking at the shape of what was said and what wasn't. This time, everything was there. She put it in the drawer with the other one and went and called Tommy, who was the only one of the 3 currently within driving distance. He answered on the second ring. "Did you get the city letter?" she asked. "Read it an hour ago." A pause. "How do you feel?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like someone who's been carrying something very heavy for a long time and just put it down," she said. "Not light, just less heavy." "That's honest. I try to be." "The ceremony," he said. "You're going to let them do it?" "Yes." "Marcus is going to want to wear the dress uniform. Marcus can wear whatever he likes. He's going to make Daniel wear his too. Daniel will complain and then do it." "Yeah." She could hear the particular quality in Tommy's voice that was the closest he regularly got to a laugh without actually producing one. "Yeah, he will." The ceremony was held on a Saturday in early spring in the main hall of Riverton's Civic Center, and it was not the small, manageable event Evelyn had privately hoped it might be. The mayor spoke. A representative from the provincial ministry spoke. A woman from the Humanitarian Awards Committee spoke at length about criteria and precedent and the importance of recognizing courage in ordinary circumstances. And by ordinary, she did not mean unremarkable, she said. She meant the kind of courage that happens in kitchens and school pickups and hospital corridors, rather than in places where courage is expected and acknowledged. Evelyn sat in the front row and listened and kept her hands in her lap. Louise Petrie was there. She had driven down from Sudbury and was sitting 3 rows back, and she and Evelyn had spoken briefly before the ceremony began. A short conversation that was not comfortable exactly, but was honest, and honesty was worth more to Evelyn at this point in her life than comfort. She had told Louise she didn't hold it against her. She meant it, and she didn't mean it, in the complicated way that things were often both true at once. She had let 15 years go by, but she had also, finally, spoken, and the speaking had mattered. Priya Anand was there with a photographer, in the back, doing her job. Evelyn caught her eye once, and Priya gave her a small nod, the nod of someone who had been following a story for weeks and understood that this was its end, or at least the end of the part she'd been able to tell. When Evelyn was called to the front of the room, she stood and walked up without notes, because she had decided she wasn't going to use notes, and if that meant she stumbled, she would stumble. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about what she wanted to say and trusted herself to say it. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room, at the faces, at her 3 sons in the front row in their dress uniforms, Marcus already at attention out of reflex, Daniel with his hands folded in his lap, Tommy looking at her with the careful, focused attention he gave everything. She said, "I'm not going to stand here and tell you this was worth it. 22 years of uncertainty, a trial, handcuffs on a courthouse steps. None of that was worth this medal. That would be a strange way to value a medal." She paused. "What I will say is that the children are worth it. They were worth it before the courts agreed, and they would have been worth it if the courts never had. Marcus and Daniel and Tommy are sitting in this room in the uniforms they earned, and they are the most important thing I have ever done with my life, and I don't need a document to tell me that." She looked at them. Marcus had the expression with no name. Daniel was looking slightly to the left of her in the way he did when he was working to contain something. Tommy was just looking at her, straight on, the way he always did. "But documents matter," she said. "Because without them, the people who were willing to use the absence of documents against me would have succeeded. Documents matter, records matter, process matters. And when those things are corrupted, it causes harm to real people in real kitchens who are just trying to keep their children warm and fed and in school." She stopped. "So I am grateful for the record being corrected. I am grateful that people looked at what happened and called it what it was. And I am grateful to be standing here rather than somewhere else." She was given the medal by the mayor, who shook her hand with both of his and said something quietly that she didn't fully catch over the sound of the room, which had broken into applause at a volume she had not anticipated. She stood and held the medal, and the room kept going, and she looked at the front row where her sons were now on their feet with everyone else, and Marcus was clapping with his jaw set the way it got, and Daniel had abandoned the careful containment, and Tommy was smiling, which was not something that happened often or lightly, and which, when it did, transformed his face entirely into something she recognized from when he was 4 years old, and she had sat beside his hospital bed and stayed. She had stayed. That was all she had done, in the beginning. She had stayed. The days after the ceremony were quieter than the ones before it. That was its own kind of relief. Marcus flew back to his posting. Daniel returned to Ottawa and the JAG caseload that had accumulated during the weeks he'd spent in Riverton. Tommy drove back the same afternoon and called her that evening to confirm he'd arrived, which was a habit he'd maintained since he was 17 and had first started making trips on his own. The house on Magnolia Street was quiet again. Evelyn walked through it on Sunday morning in the particular way you walk through a house when you have it to yourself. Slowly, without purpose, noticing things. The way the light came through the kitchen window at 9 in the morning. The photograph still sitting in the corner of the hallway mirror, the boys squinting into the sun. She had been asked, at a follow-up meeting with the mayor's office, whether she would be interested in joining an advisory committee the city was establishing, a new oversight body for the Child and Family Services intake process, designed to catch exactly the kind of administrative failure that had defined her case. They had been careful to frame it as an invitation rather than an expectation, and she had been careful to say she needed time to consider it. She had considered it during the ceremony, and on the drive home, and during the walk through the quiet house on Sunday morning. She knew what she was going to say. She had known, if she was honest with herself, before they finished asking. Because here was the thing that 31 years of nursing and 22 years of raising boys in a gap the system had deliberately maintained had taught her the gap didn't close itself. Someone had to sit in it and keep pushing and refuse to be moved, not out of stubbornness but out of the understanding that the children who fell into it were real, and their realness did not diminish because a form hadn't been filed or a caseworker hadn't called back or a development company had identified their situation as leverage. She had been the person in the gap for 22 years. She knew its dimensions. She knew what it felt like from the inside, and she knew what it looked like from the outside. And she knew, more specifically than anyone who would be appointed to that committee, where it was most likely to be found. She called the mayor's office Monday morning and told them yes. The woman who answered said she would pass the message along and they would be in touch about the appointment process. Evelyn thanked her and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a moment with her phone in her hand. Outside the window, the street was the same street it had always been. The south end was empty now where the hoardings had been, and there were no cranes. The ground that had been disturbed was settling back into itself in the slow, unglamorous way that disturbed ground always did. She thought about what she would say at the committee's first meeting, whenever that was. She thought about the questions she would ask about intake timelines and caseworker assignment protocols, and the documentation requirements for household situations that didn't fit the standard categories. She thought about all the things she knew that weren't in any manual, things that could only be known by someone who had spent decades living them. She was 71 years old, and she had more to do. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. She got up and put on her coat and went out to the garden. The beds she and Marcus had cleared were still bare, but the soil was workable now in a way it hadn't been 2 months ago. She crouched down and turned a section of it with her hand, checking the texture, checking what was coming back. Underneath the surface, where you couldn't see it yet, things were moving. That was how it always worked. The visible part came later, after the invisible work had already been done for a long time. She had always understood that. She had built her entire life on understanding it. There are people the world tries to erase quietly, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with paperwork and silence, and the slow pressure of systems designed to make the uncomplicated ones give up. They count on exhaustion. They count on isolation. They count on the belief that one person, without credentials or authority or the right connections, cannot hold their ground indefinitely against institutions that have been built to outlast individuals. What they cannot account for is a woman who stayed in a hospital ward with a child who had stopped eating, who stayed through 19 years of unresolved paperwork and 3 years of case management gaps and a trial designed to humiliate her into silence, who stayed not because she was fearless. She had been afraid. She had been angry. She had sat in a car in her own driveway and talked herself back into the house more nights than she could count, but because leaving would have required abandoning something she was not willing to abandon. The boys had grown into men who understood that the way you understood something you had learned from your bones outward rather than from a classroom inward. They carried it with them into their work, into their decisions, into the way they had come back for her without hesitation when the time came. She had not raised them to be impressive. She had raised them to be decent. Impressiveness was what decency accumulated into, over time, when it was sustained under pressure. She had not planned that. She had just kept going, and they had kept going with her, and eventually the going had brought them here, to this garden, to this street, to a ceremony in a civic hall, and a medal she would probably put in the kitchen drawer with the letters, because she was not a person who displayed things. She was a person who kept them. She pressed her palm flat against the soil. It was cold and real and hers. She had a committee to join and a garden to plant and a drawer full of documents that now said, in the language of official record, what had always been true in every language that mattered. She had stayed. They had come back. The rest, the charges, the removals, the collapsed development schemes, the men in offices who were now answering to investigators instead of approving applications, the rest was consequence. The consequence of one woman who had refused, quietly and completely, to become what they needed her to be. She had never been loud about any of it. She had never needed to be. The truth had a way of being loud enough on its own when someone gave it enough time. Evelyn Brooks turned the soil and planned her spring, and behind her Magnolia Street held its ground.